In order to begin rigging up the Mulcore character, we need to bring in some geometry. If you open up the browser by pressing your 5 hotkey and accessing the models folder of the Exercise 7 training project, you can drag and drop the model.emdl file into your scene and close the browser. If you switch to your Explorer, just middle click on the top A window there, you can see that we have a hidden model, and inside of that model we have 4 pieces of geometry. The body geometry, if you note, already has a set of UVs added to it. If we open up the polygon mesh property, look in the clusters folder, we have a set of texture coordinates, and the Mulcore character has a set of UVs predefined. If you have the character selected and you press Alt-7, you can see that UV layout. The reason we have this here is because the Mulcore character is essentially naked, and the texture map has a lot of details for where different muscle groups lie. So to help us in placing bones and setting up the muscle system correctly, it would be a good idea to actually add the texture map. If we go full screen on our camera view and switch to a texture decal mode, all we have at the moment is a flat shaded character. So we'll change that. I'm going to access the Materials Manager of XSI by switching to the Render toolset, pressing the number 3 hotkey, and modifying the materials, so basically going into the Materials Manager. So we've got a library here that has a single scene material in it, and if I click on that scene material and check out who uses it, every object in the scene does, and we don't really want that. We just want the body geometry to have its own material shader. So I'll go in and create a new material. And they always build fongs as presets, but you can change that pretty easily. And I'm going to use the drag and drop preset manager within the material manager to connect some new nodes to this fong. I'm going to assign the shader first of all to my piece of geo, so I'm going to select the character, the fong preset selected in the material manager, right click and assign the body geometry to the selection. And I'm just going to rename this by pressing F2, and I'll call this the Mulcore body material. Now this is just a temporary material I'm using just to visualize the textures. Eventually we're going to be using other shaders that aren't Fong, Lambert, blend base. We'll be using the subsurface scattering shaders to texture map this body. But for now, I'm going to replace the Fong on the character. I don't really need to see the specular highlights. If I draw a render region, these specular highlights might just get in my way while I'm setting up the rig, so I'm just going to use a Lambert shader. If I look in the illumination section of nodes, I'm just going to bring in a Lambert shader, and one of the nice things here is just be able to drag and drop that shader on top of an existing illumination shader and have it replace not only the shader, but the connections to other shaders. So inside of that Lambert shader, I want to plug a texture map into the illumination diffuse channel. So I can do that one of 2 ways. I can double click on the diffuse and connect straight to that. Or I can actually just use the texture folder and pull in an image node, which brings in an image node and a reference to a picture, in this case the no icon pic that's shared by everything when we first bring in a texture map. I'm going to output the image node, the image output into the diffuse input of the Lambert, and right away we get the no icon pic being mapped out on the character using our set of UVs. And I'm just going to edit that image node by double clicking on it and point the texture to the color map on the Mulcore character. And if we look in the pictures folder by clicking new from file, the pictures folder has 5 textures in there already, and one of them is the color map for Mulcore. So any dangling node in the render tree or in the ice tree for that matter will remain behind, so if you don't want that no icon pic, you can just blow it away. So that's all we really need for now. We'll be adding to this a lot later, so I'm just going to close that down, and we have the first part of our setup ready. The second thing that I would probably need to do here is I'm just going to rearrange the nodes inside of a new model. I basically brought the character in as a model, and think about the model node here as a kind of a packaging for your character. If you were to go into a toy store and have a look at the toy section of different action figures. Each action figure is contained inside of its own plastic wrap and cardboard backing, and it's what makes each character unique from all the other characters in that section of the toy store. All the weapons and clothing and all the different accessories that the character has are embedded in that packaging, and the model is kind of like a packaging here. We don't really animate it, much like when you have a little toy G.I. Joe or a toy Star Wars figure. You don't really animate the packaging or move that around. You just take the character out of the packaging and move it, and you can put the character back in the packaging when you're done to keep it nice and organized. Most of us lose the packaging, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just going to take these polygon objects. If you were creating your own character from scratch, it would look something like this. I'm going to drag and drop those elements to the scene root and delete the model node. So at this moment, this would be like the equivalent of having all of the parts of your character sitting in a loose bin with all the other characters that might be in that store. So it might be difficult to isolate all the particular objects that belong to a character. So to organize it, we're going to switch back to the model toolset by pressing 1, and we're going to create a new model file. So create a new package to put the Mulcore character into. And at the moment we just have geometry, but that's okay. I'm going to call this the Mulcore model. And I typically hide the model nodes just because they're a visual in the 3D viewport. And again, we don't really want to be animating this. We just want to use the model space as a package to contain our objects. So I'm going to rename my polygon mesh objects as well before I drag and drop them into my model space. So we've got some eyes for the character. So we have the left eye. Notice what I do is I always try to incorporate some kind of keyword that tells me what kind of object I'm working with. Using F2. We have the right eye geo. We have the Mulcore body geo. And finally, if we look inside the character, she has a big old brain. So I'll call that the brain geo. I'll take all of these pieces, shift select them, and I'll move them up into the model space. So the only thing we really see from the Explorer, other than the lights and cameras, is the hidden model space, and we don't see any reference to the character until we actually open up the model. Another thing that I like to do before rigging is template my geometry. And what I mean by that is, if you're placing bones inside of a piece of geo, it's a little bit annoying if you're trying to select a bone or select a component of a bone and move it around, and all the while you can still select your geometry, and more often than not you'll select your geometry over that skeletal object. So what I'm going to do is find a way of organizing the objects that are geometry based and control their selectability. Now normally people control selectability either directly on the object, so accessing the object's visibility attribute and disabling selectability there. But when you're working with a character that has a lot of pieces, you want a one-button solution that will do this in one shot. If I select my objects here, I could use one of two features in XSI. If I switch to the keying panel / layer editor and switch from animation layers to scene layers, you have your basic layer controls, whether it's visibility, view visibility, render visibility, or selectability. So we could toggle our objects that way by dropping our objects in a new layer from selection, and toggling the selectability of that layer. Now unfortunately, layers are a great feature, but they don't port with the character. In other words, if I take this model or this packaging and I decide to export that model separately from the scene, the layer information will not export with the character. The layer information tends to get stored with the scene file. So I'd be actually forced to save scenes as opposed to exporting models, and we'll talk a little bit about that as the rigging goes along. So a better way of doing this, rather than using the scene layers, is to switch back to the main command panel, select our geometry, and use the group command. You can use it under Edit, Create Group, and we can see that the hotkey is Control-G. Now if we create a group, we get an icon sitting at the base of our scene root. If I zip up the model, you can see it sits underneath the scene root as a child. I'm just going to rename that group, call it the geo group. We can see that the items inside of the geo group are clearly labeled, And for some people it looks like the objects are duplicated, when in actual fact the group is just listing the items that belong to the group. And the groups have 4 core attributes. If I click on the symbol of the group: selectability, visibility, and render visibility. I just want to toggle the selectability of the GeoGroup, so I do not want to allow selecting those members. So I'll close the attribute down, and when we deselect, anything that's unselectable or templated will show up as a light gray as opposed to black. And it also shows up in the Explorer as well. If we switch the GeoGroup attributes back to have no effect on the selectability, you can see they turn black. So I'm going to leave that on do not allow selecting members. And again, anytime I add a new component to my character, I want to make sure that that new component is stored inside of the packaging of my character. So I'll take the GeoGroup and drop it into my model. So things are looking pretty good right now. What I'll actually do is, as I'm building the model, I'm going to continually either A, save the scene file, and B, export the model. If you click on the model file, you can export the model by using the File Export Model command, or by right-clicking on the model and exporting it directly from within the Explorer. So I have the original model that contained just the geo, and now I'm going to re-export the model as a model called Melkor model, where I've renamed it and added the groups and the texture map, obviously. One of the things I can also do is save a scene file backup. And when I do so, I can copy all external files into my project. And what this means is that if the texture map I was using was outside of the project and it wasn't in the pictures folder, those texture maps would be saved inside of the project file. Another neat feature is if you enable the render region, Q, it's kind of hard to see because there's very little light in the scene, but we get a little region, mental ray region of the character, and when I actually go to save the scene file now, I can use the render region as a thumbnail just to help me visualize what I'm saving a little better, and again, copy all external files into my project. So I'll call this Melkor Start Skeleton. And if I try to open up the scene or save it again, you can see that the icon now is a thumbnail associated with it. So there's the first part of our setup.